Hello students, today we will be discussing the topic Women's Representation in Local Self-Government. This is a highly relevant topic in contemporary times when there is a lot of debate and discussion going on about the role of effective representation of women in various legislative bodies. Let us divide this topic into a number of areas. We will first start with the question of women's representation in the various international framework and how India has adopted women's representation as an important issue in terms of providing a voice to women not only at the national level but also at the local level. The second part of the discussion would revolve on Panchayati Raj institutions as engines of local self-development, at the same time trying to look at local self-government and Panchayati Raj institutions as models providing for women's representation and a voice in execution of local development projects. The third part of the discussion will focus on the significance of the 73rd Constitution Amendment Act, the various provisions of the Constitution Amendment Act, and how this particular act is a landmark constitutional development in terms of providing women a voice at the local level. Let us first move on with this question of women's representation in international normative framework. Now, women's rights to equal political participation at all levels of government have been recognized in various international normative frameworks, which are the Beijing Declaration and Platform for Action, as well as endorsed decades later in the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development Goals. The importance of equal participation and representation of women at all levels of government decision making is clear in the wording of the Sustainable Development Goal Target 5.5. To quote 5.5 Agenda, we should ensure women's full and effective participation and equal opportunities for leadership at all levels of decision making in political, economic and public life, and the choice of indicators for monitoring progress in achieving this particular target. Two specific indicators on women's representation in decision making in political life. The first agenda is contained in 5.51A, which is on women's representation in Parliament, and this was previously included in the Millennium Development Goals monitoring framework. This Millennium Development Goal framework provided for a greater space for women in decision-making institutions. The SDG indicator 5.5.1b is a new indicator on women's representation in local government. Research indicates that women in local decision-making positions redefine local priorities by being more inclusive, prioritizing family-friendly policies and measures, and in some contexts by contributing to greater gender equality in terms of income, employment, and parental leave. Thus, we can see that more women representatives in the local decision-making units will definitely aid the cause of not only women but also greater community participation and development. Now, let us try to understand how do we achieve gender representation or women's representation in local decision-making bodies. Is it so easy? Now, around the world, a concept is very important. We call it legislative quotas for women. This legislative quotas for women are effective measures to increase women's representation not only in the national legislatures but also in local government. The adoption of gender quotas has significantly changed and improved countries' trends in women's representation not only in developed countries but also in developing countries of the world. Existing research based on official data illustrates the leap in the election of women after implementing quotas. I'll give you some examples. For instance, in France, the execution and implementation of the parity law introduced in 2000 changed women's share in municipal councils from 26% in 1995 elections to 48% in 2001 elections. This is a major leap forward so far as women's representation in France is considered after the passage of the parity law. In Slovenia, the legislated quota introduced in 2005 increased the proportion of women elected to municipal offices from 13% in 2002 to 22% in 2006. This is a major leap given the time period that was taken into consideration. In Spain, quotas introduced in 2007 and 2011 resulted in an increase in women's representation from 26% in 2003 to 35% in 2015. All the three cases that I just illustrated speaks one clear point, that legislative quotas has a positive impact on women's representation in Panchayati Raj or local self-development institutions. Let us try to understand the Indian case from this perspective. The Indian Constitution, adopted in 1950, envisaged a federal structure of government with a central government and multiple state governments as well as union territories. India's founding father, Mahatma Gandhi, had conceived of India's independence with village as the basis of the whole structure. In fact, he visualized that independence must begin from the bottom. Thus, every village will be a republic. Panchayats will be units of independent, self-sustaining units, and they would have full powers at their disposal. In this structure composed of innumerable villages, there would be ever-winding, never-ascending circles. That means panchayats will be institutions of power, they would be executing programs, and in the process panchayats would become self-sufficient. There was legislation for rural local bodies at the village, taluks, district level in India, and let us try to understand the fact that Panchayati Raj institutions or local self-government are not new in India, or they are not a reward provided by the colonial British government. In fact, panchayats or Panchayati Raj institutions had been popular in ancient India also. Now, if you look into the Constitution of India, does it provide provisions for local self-government? Now, before 1992, Article 40 of the Constitution, which is a part of the directive principles of state policy, provides that the state shall take steps to organize village panchayats and endow them with such powers and authority as may be necessary to enable them to function as units of self-government. After the enactment of the 73rd Constitution Amendment Act in 1992, 3-tier Panchayati Raj institutions were introduced in all the states in a uniform manner. Now, the history of local self-government in India includes phases of creating very strong local self-government. Alternatively, we also find local self-governments declining into dormancy and decay. Now, in 1950, after independence, India embarked upon a community development program for community-based participation in all developmental projects, which also provided for a special role for village panchayats in development projects. In 1957, a study team reviewing the working of community development projects in that context tried to understand the success of this community participation. Now, it's very interesting to note that the study team noted that the rural local bodies have not been fully involved in community development, and the nominated advisory bodies formed at local levels did not ensure effective people's participation. So what happened was that from the 1960s to 1980s, a number of committees were set up with two objectives. One, to streamline and institutionalize local self-government in India, at the same time provide a voice to different categories and classes of people within local self-government institutions. We need to focus on the Balwant Rai study team, which is credited with giving us a blueprint of the structure of rural local bodies at the different levels, which are the district, block as well as the village level, and they started the task of revitalization of these local self institutions. Initiatives were taken for legislation, constitution of rural local bodies and endowing them with powers, responsibilities as well as resources. However, this was followed by a phase of neglect as well as decline. The next committee which was entrusted with this task was the Ashok Mehta Committee, which again gave certain fresh recommendations for reviving local self-institutions in India. Now, the decade of 1980s witnessed fresh effort for a comprehensive look at the whole question, including their composition, representation, functions, resources, as well as constitutional guarantee for their existence as well as functioning. In December 1992, a historic step was taken with the enactment of the 73rd Constitution Amendment, which provided for specific provisions laying out clearly the composition, powers, functions, as well as the various structure included in rural local governance in India. Now let us try to understand where do women position themselves so far as Panchayati Raj institutions in India. Now we already have studied that village councils or panchayats are definitely not new in India. They have existed since the times of ancient governments, and we also find that during the colonial times as well as post-independence, various structures and institutions of local self-government existed at different levels in the different states. But what is new is how they have been given the constitutional mandate to be represented in these institutions. Now please understand, students, that before 1992, it was not that women never participated in local self-government or Panchayati Raj institutions. They participated, but they had to contest in open seats, and it was very difficult for them to have a voice in Panchayati Raj institutions. What happened after 1992 was that there was a clear-cut reservation for them, and there were certain seats which were reserved for women where no other person could get themselves elected, and they definitely had a voice in terms of execution of rural development programs. Now let us go a little deep into how the system of women's representation in Panchayati Raj institution evolved in India. Now the 73rd Constitution Amendment Act has mandated 1/3 representation of seats in rural local self-governing institutions, which means 1/3 seats would be reserved for women. Now earlier there were 1 or 2 women members in this Panchayati Raj institutions who were nominated by government or co-opted by the predominantly influential, powerful male leadership of these panchayats. So that was a token representation of women. The reservation of at least 1/3 membership and chairperson's positions in panchayats at all 3 levels is a constitutional imperative. So whether Panchayat Raj institutions and the male leadership like it or not, this has become a constitutional obligation which has to be implemented. Another important thing that we need to note here is that this reservation is not only in the total membership but also within those reserved for the scheduled caste, scheduled tribes, thus providing for women's representation across caste and class. Thus, now all panchayats at every level will have at least 1/3 women members. This does not mean they cannot contest in other seats. They can definitely contest in other seats also, but 1/3 representation is mandated by the Constitution. And it is also provided that at least 1/3 of panchayats at each level, right from the district to the village, will be headed by women chairpersons or women pradhans. Thus we find that this mandate of 1/3 representation has actually provided for what we say inclusive politics. This has actually legitimized entry of women into the political process of the country. Now, we can also look at it and analyze it in another form, that where we consider grassroots democracy to be the basis of effective democratic political participation. It is not just enough to have more women as voters. It is also important to have more women representatives. This is considered by political scholars and sociologists as a major step towards inclusive politics and addressing, as it does, their continued political marginality, and in the long run, this has a potential to change gender relations in different legislative bodies. Now we need to understand that Panchayat Raj institutions were not new. But women's representation, do we find any laws, any policies, any enactments which spoke about women's representation in the colonial times? Now, we need to understand the first official initiative for constituting statutory village panchayats. The question of women's representation was not openly raised whether in the Constituent Assembly debates or later on in the initial phase of Lok Sabha debates. Even on the subject of women's franchise at all levels, the Joint Select Committee of British Parliament in its first report on the Bill for the Government of India Act 1919 only endorsed the representation of the Franchise Committee. I quote the Franchise Committee report. The question whether women should or should not be admitted to the franchise on the same terms as men should be left to the newly elected Legislative Council of each province to settle by resolution. It seems to them to go deep into the social system and susceptibilities of India, and therefore to be a question which can only with any prudence be settled in accordance with the wishes of Indians themselves as constitutionally expressed. They left it to the Indians to decide at the provincial level whether they would admit women legislators or not. Thus, they maintained a distance so far as equal franchise for women along with men could be realized or not. In the first set of Panchayat Acts, which started off from 1920 itself, in the then provinces as well as princely states, women did not figure as representatives or as voters, since we had the concept of limited franchise during that point of time. In accordance with the then prevalent ideology, they were not considered to deserve any specific attention in the public arena. In fact, the Panchayat legislation in some provinces specifically excluded them, and the creation of panchayats was also voluntary and discretionary. In the central provinces Village Panchayat Act 1920, it is very interesting to observe that the deputy commissioner was to make an enquiry into the desirability of establishing a gram panchayat and could establish a panchayat only on the application made to him by a district council or by not less than 20 adult male residents of a village or a group of adjacent villages. Now, if you look into the phrasing of this sentence, it is evident and clear that only male adult members were allowed to make a representation for the establishment of village panchayats. Women were definitely not a part of this entire system of representation in local self-government. The elected panchas were to be from the male owners of houses and proprietors or tenants of land permanently resident within a circle. So here also house owners have to come from male members. So female owners will definitely not have the power to apply also. The Holkar State Panchayat Act 1920 included property qualification voting, and there was no reference to either male or female. The Indore Village Panchayat Act, which was enacted a couple of years later in 1928, specified that the collector, who was called a Subha, may, with the sanction of the minister, establish a panchayat on his own motion or on the report of the Amin or on receipt of the application of not less than 20 adult male residents of a village, and bona fide adult male residents of a village were entitled to elect panchayats. So it was clear. The acts clearly eliminated women's representation in any form, either as voters or as representatives. Now, it was only the Indore Gram Panchayat Act enacted in 1947 that provided for vote by every bona fide adult male resident and resident adult woman who were able to read and write and had immovable property. This phrase was inserted in the 1947 Act. Now, by logic, if you look into the time 1947, only a minuscule of women would definitely fall in that category, because a large percentage of women were either illiterate, and the question of having property in the name of women was remotely possible at that point of time. Property tax or primary education qualification were needed for being elected, and a woman with these qualifications was also made eligible to contest. But there were hardly any women to contest for these positions, given the nature of society and the societal structure at that point of time. In the UP Village Panchayat Act 1920, the panchas as well as sarpanch were to be appointed by the collector, hence there was no reference to male or female. The Bombay Village Panchayat Act also stipulated that no person can become an elected member who was a female, and elections were to be held in each village by the adult male residents therein at a meeting presided over with the help of a deputy collector. In undivided Bengal also, the law of 1990 stipulated that the electorate was to consist of all the adult males having residence within the union paying local tax. Thus, one thing is clear in all the legislative enactments that we just studied in the pre-independent period, that women were consciously mooted out of this entire system of representation, whether as voters or as representatives in different bodies. However, the 73rd Constitution Amendment Act 1992, which I had already said, is a landmark in terms of providing representation to women by providing certain number of seats exclusively for women. Let us now come to the 73rd Constitution Amendment Act and what are the specific provisions it inserted to strengthen not just local self-governments but also women's representation. Article 243D(1) provides that the seats shall be reserved for scheduled caste and scheduled tribes in every panchayat. Article 243D clause 2 states that not less than 1/3 of the total number of seats reserved under clause 1 shall be reserved for women belonging to the scheduled caste and scheduled tribes. The number of seats reserved for the scheduled caste and scheduled tribes women would be allotted by rotation to different constituencies in a panchayat. So we need to understand that seats were not just reserved for scheduled tribes and scheduled castes but also for women belonging to scheduled caste and scheduled tribes, and seats would be allotted on the basis of rotation in different constituencies so that we have a system of uniform representation of women, scheduled caste and scheduled tribe members in almost all Gram Panchayat and Panchayati Raj institutions. Article 243D clause 3 provides that not less than 1/3 of the total number of seats to be filled by direct election in every panchayat shall be reserved for women, and that such seats may be allotted by rotation to different constituencies in a panchayat, which means that in every election the reserved seats in a panchayat constituency would vary from one year to another year. So if in this year you have constituency A which is reserved for women, in the next election constituency A will not be a reserved position for women, that seat would become open, whereas constituency B will now be a reserved seat for women. So this system would ensure greater and better representation of women in Panchayati Raj institutions. Article 243D(4) provides that the office of the chairperson in the panchayats at the village or any other level shall also be reserved for women, and such reservation shall not be less than 1/3 of the total number of offices of chairpersons in the panchayats at each level. The offices so reserved at the level of the chairperson will be allotted by rotation to different panchayats at each level. This particular constitutional amendment has ensured two specific provisions for women. Number one, reservation of seats for women in Panchayati Raj institutions. Number two, ensuring that pradhans and chairpersons also come from women's representatives. So we have tried to ensure that women are not just elected to provide a lip service to Panchayati Raj institutions, but also they get a greater leadership role by becoming a pradhan or a chairperson in various institutions. On the basis of the discussion that we have had today, we can safely conclude that women's representation in Panchayati Raj institutions have not only led to an increase in the number of women's representatives in all the tiers of Panchayati Raj institutions, but also have demonstrated their capability to act as effective decision makers in the process of community and rural development. It has also provided them with a space to demonstrate their potential and to prove their capabilities as partners in local self-government. Let us not forget that there are a lot of challenges that women face when it comes to decision making at local level, but definitely reservation for women in Panchayati Raj institutions have aided the process of women's empowerment in decision making in the grassroots level. Thank you.